Okay. All right. All right. Thank you very much. Welcome. Welcome to the Rockefeller Institute on a beautiful day. My name's Tom Gais. I'm director of the Rockefeller Institute. We have a wonderful panel today, a wonderful forum. Oreos and Dubonnet. This is a new book out of SUNY Press on the Rockefeller, Nelson A. Rockefeller years. And we have a fantastic panel. But before that, we're going to have a presentation, a discussion of the book itself. The book is by Joe Boyd and Charlie Holcomb. Charlie will be talking about the book. He will be introduced by Christine Ward, our New York State archivist. And that'll be followed by a panel discussion of several people prominent in this book and prominent in the Nelson Rockefeller administration who can take us back to those years. It's a fun book. I've actually just finished reading it last night, although I was given it some time before. There are great stories. The Ron Abney stories about 2 airplanes in Paraguay is worth the price all by itself. But I also think it's a rather poignant story, especially in this election season. There's a lot of talk these days about the big questions, the big choices we have in this election year, about choosing the direction of going to big government or to small government, between what some people might call socialism, some people might call Ayn Randism. But what's wonderful about this book, at least I think, or at least is there's no obsessive theorizing about what the public sector should do or what the private sector should do. In fact, there's not a whole lot of theorizing at all. It shows an administration that is just out to deal with public problems, public issues, using whatever resources are at hand. It's a pragmatic view of solving problems, of building a better state, increasing opportunities for people, and how that's done and who does it really depends on the circumstances and the availability of the talents, in particular places. In fact, what it seems to, as I was reading the book, you get a sense of a kind of permeable government. I mean, Nelson Rockefeller seemed to reach out to all kinds of folks, whether they had any experience with government, that he thought they had the talents or the expertise, the ambition to really do big things and good things. He was interested in them. So it's an interesting contrast to some of the situations we see ourselves in right now. I think it's especially fitting that the book often takes the position of advanced men, and they were generally men, I guess, back then. The people who actually reached out to the localities on the ground, talking to people, and finding out just how to really connect to all these strange localities and all these different people. So, I want to thank Joe Boyd and Charlie Holcomb for writing this book. I want to thank him especially. It makes us proud here at the Institute to bear this name, to continue to focus on the things that Nelson Rockefeller wanted, among them getting the real facts about public problems and getting them out to the public. I also want to thank Bob Bullock, who's done an enormous amount of work to put this event together. I want to thank SUNY Press for publishing an excellent book. And I want to at least also note that this is being recorded for the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center of Dartmouth College, another fine institution. Right now, and that they will be looking at this video, looking at this event after the video recording is done. You will find these video and audio recording as well as a written up summary of today's event on our website at www.rockins.org. So I'd like to right now ask everybody to be sure to power down your cell phones. Anything else is likely to go beep. And I will just turn you over now to Christine Ward, the New York State Archivist. Christine.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon. What a wonderful crowd. We are thrilled to see this great turnout for the launch of this wonderful book. The New York State Archives Partnership Trust is absolutely delighted to be partnering with the Rockefeller Institute and with SUNY Press on this very special event. This is the official launch of our newest collaboration, which is Oreos and Dubonnet, remembering Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller. And I think I won't go into any detail on the book. Tom's already talked about it. You're going to hear lots about it. But I think one of the most fascinating recollections that I have read in a very long time. I want to especially welcome the book's authors, Joe Boyd and Charles Holcomb, as well as many of our board members and stewards, elected officials who are here today, and other friends. We would also like to welcome and thank our colleagues from WMHT Public Television, whose broadcast efforts are enabling us to reach out to the Rockefeller Center at Dartmouth University. Several years ago, we began this journey with our chair, John Hanna, from whom you will hear in a little while. John came to us with this delightful manuscript with stories that had been collected over the course of Joe Boyd's tenure working with Governor Rockefeller. And when we first read the manuscript, we knew that it was such an incredibly special effort, and it was one worthy of far greater public attention. So to assist us in making the publication of this wonderful manuscript a reality, Bob Phillips came forward with a significant donation, and I do think it's fair to say that without his generosity, this project could not have happened. So we're very, very grateful to Bob Phillips for doing this for us. Then we enlisted the cooperation of a just extraordinary journalist, Charlie Holcomb, and also our good friends at SUNY Press, led by its director, James Peltz. And for those of you who have read the book, you already know that you are going to find in this book some very candid and personal insights from the book's authors and contributors. And they really do provide, I think, a real-life portrait of one of New York's most iconic political figures. For those of you who have not read this book, following today's program, and actually prior to, the book is available for purchase. This is the commercial. And you can have it inscribed by our very special guests as well. So we encourage you to stop by the table out there and purchase the book and get it signed. Now, on to our program. Charles R. Holcomb covered the Rockefeller administration for a decade as a legislative correspondent and political reporter in Albany for the Gannett newspapers. He began his reporting career as a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun. And then that was before he moved to Rochester, working for Gannett's Times-Union out in Rochester. He later served as publisher of the Ithaca Journal, and then as director of communications for Governor Hugh Carey during his second term in office. He subsequently worked at a New York financial public relations firm, Adams and Reinhardt, before establishing his own firm, Holcomb and Associates. Here to begin our discussion on Governor Nelson Rockefeller is the co-author of Oreos and Dubonnet, our good friend, Charles Holcomb.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Thank you, Christine, for that very generous invitation, and certainly for your support along the way in this lengthy process of getting this book together. It will come as no surprise, I'm sure, that I'm reading from a text as opposed to winging it verbally. I come from an older generation of journalism, where before blogs and so on, and so I'm going to read it with your indulgence. I'm awed and impressed as I look out over this audience, and it reminds me of the time that a newly elected governor, who shall be nameless, stood at the podium at the yard at Sing Sing Correctional Facility, where he was to give a talk to the inmates about his plans for improving prison conditions. He looked out over the large crowd of inmates and smiled broadly. "My fellow citizens," he began, and then he stopped, realizing that his audience was mostly felons who couldn't vote. Flustered, he started again. "My fellow Democrats," he said, but that didn't sound just right either. "My fellow inmates," he finally said, but stopped again, thinking how that would play in the newspapers. "Well," he finally said, "I just want to tell you how glad I am to see so many of you here." And I'm glad to see so many of you here to talk about the ways and wiles of one of New York's most effective and interesting governors. And I'm especially glad to see Joe Boyd, my co-author, whose vision and efforts launched this whole project. Hundreds of thousands of words have been written, of course, about Nelson Rockefeller in newspapers, magazines, and books. In print and on television over the years, his successes and failures have been dissected in detail, his strengths extolled, his faults exposed, and more is yet to come. Yet, I have to say that I think this book is unique. This book that is the pretext of our gathering today, in that it focuses more on how he operated rather than the specifics of what he accomplished. The portrait of the governor, as seen through the eyes of his senior staff and other colleagues, and of legislators he dealt with, of union leaders, reporters, politicians, and ordinary citizens who had occasion to watch him in action. He was a man who had his patterns, his ways of working and making decisions, his likes, his dislikes. He was a workaholic, an incurable optimist, and a skillful political operator who did not hesitate to use his personality, his wealth, his connections, and his political clout to advance his agenda. Usually, though not always, he got his way, as many of the stories in this book illustrate. Probably nobody in the Rockefeller administration knew those patterns and habits better than Joe Boyd, who served as the governor's personal aide and chief advance man, among other things, throughout the Rockefeller years. Many of you have known Joe for half a century, I know, and I've known him for almost that long. Let me tell you a little bit about Joe, for those of you who are not familiar with him. He grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, son of a stockbroker, and got interested in politics while still in high school. At Colgate University, he was an active Republican, and in his junior year, when he was president of the Colgate Young Republican Club, he was recruited by Rockefeller himself during a visit to the campus to create Students for Rockefeller. And he created these organizations all across New York State at various campuses, something like 17, and he never looked back. Now, Joe saw this book as a coffee table book with anecdotes by and about the governor's staff members, colleagues, and others. And the idea was to show how it was in those days. and also to bring some attention to the excellent people the governor had gathered around him. Joe saw that time was beginning to thin the ranks, and so, to preserve memories of that eventful, innovative 15-year administration, he began to collect stories. He solicited former staffers, legislators, political operatives, and office holders. Now, Joe's illness eventually brought the project to a halt, and he turned his raw materials over to the law firm of Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna, as you have heard. Two of the founders of that firm are among the panel today, John Hanna and Mike Whiteman. I should say that John is a very old friend, and that he got me involved in this book. And that was, I hate to say it, at the end of 2007. It has taken quite a while. As a reporter in the Albany Bureau of the Gannett newspapers, I had covered the governor during most of his years in office, plus 2 of his 4 gubernatorial campaigns and his 1968 presidential effort. I also covered a large part of his ill-fated trips to Latin America for President Nixon, which are discussed in this book as well. Of course, I knew Joe and a great many others in the administration as a result of that, but I'd never written a book before and was no longer in the news business and had been away from politics and state government for 25 years. But it seemed like a fit, and I was delighted to take it on. Now, Joe had gathered an amazing array of anecdotes from all kinds of people in and out of the administration. How to organize it and tie them together was a question. The book seemed to need a unifying theme that would give it some substance and a little more relevance for today's quite different political climate. Nelson Rockefeller's ability to get done what he wanted to get done was legendary, and what had always impressed me was the adroit way in which he used his skills and various advantages to create a tilt in his direction in everybody he dealt with. And that became kind of the unifying theme, and it was a prime focus of many of the interviews I subsequently conducted for the book, including everybody on this panel. Had I known how long it would take before the finished book saw the light of day, I would have done a few things differently, hindsight being 20/20, and I would have sought more interviews and earlier. Not only had some of the most knowledgeable insiders died by the time I took on the project, but more passed on before I was ready to interview them. Former Press Secretary Ron Majorana and Appointments Secretary and Superintendent of Banks Harry Albright are 2 notable examples among many. And some of those whom I did not interview because they'd been interviewed so often, Bill Ronan, for example, I think I would certainly have approached. But I must say that those I did interview were most helpful, forthcoming, and I hope accurate in their recollections. And there were a few stories in Joe's material that we didn't include, either because they were duplicative, couldn't be correctly attributed, or weren't terribly useful. And of course, some stories from my interviews didn't make it into the book either. Illness in our family and moving to a new house slowed the writing process, and SUNY Press had its lumps too, what with steep budget and staff cuts and moving its offices, and that also slowed things down. Historian Richard Norton Smith of George Mason University, who's completing Volume 2 of the late Carey Reich's excellent 2-volume biography of Rockefeller, gave Joe permission to use some of the anecdotes he had gleaned in numerous interviews. But as the nature of the book changed, of our book changed, it became clear that his publishers wouldn't allow that, even with appropriate credits. So we had to spend some time sorting out exactly which stories came from whom, and that took a while, but it all worked out. just as an aside, it was a bit of a challenge for me to work with the SUNY's systems for producing a book. And I've always used the AP style as a newspaper writer, and they use a different style, and that was a challenge. And I also found that all the footnotes turned out to be endnotes, and I hope you will all, if you're reading the book, stick with it and read those endnotes, even though if they're out of context at the time. In any case, it was a pleasure to work with the SUNY Press people, starting with editor James Peltz, who was most supportive, despite dealing with a move and a budget crisis, and Fran Keniston, the marketing specialist, and Ryan Morris, the production editor, who's also here today, were helpful and competent, and I thank you all. Nelson Rockefeller's accomplishments as governor, and you're probably going to hear more about those from the panel than you are from me, as well as federal official and private citizen, will surely prove a continuing bonanza for historians and students of government. But before we get to the discussion by the panel, who along with others in this room are themselves great troves of information about the Rockefeller administration, let me just add this. Nelson Rockefeller never reached the presidency, though he was a heartbeat away in his final 2 years as a public figure. And it was ironic that he was appointed vice president and not elected. And he was appointed in the first place. That he was appointed in the first place was a testament not only to his support within the Republican Party, but rather to the competence and character reflected in his 15 years as governor. He had many adversaries, but few real enemies. He was not without flaws, but he was good at his trade, and we hope this book contributes to the understanding of how he applied that trade. So in conclusion, I want to thank the New York State Archives Partnership Trust for its sponsorship of the book, and Bob Phillips for funding it especially. And SUNY Press deserves great thanks for its willingness to publish the book and put up with me. And I know I speak for Joe Boyd as well when I say thanks to you, the audience, for coming today and for your interest in Oreos and Dubonnet. Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for coming. Over the past year, several years actually, my colleagues and I in the LCA, which is the Legislative Correspondence Association, have reported on an array of issues with roots planted during the Rockefeller administration. Issues like the current governor's new Justice Center, implications of the Taylor Law, changing mission of SUNY, the State University, and the growth of Medicaid. These are all topics that we explore daily. And it's precisely this immediacy and relevance that makes this event so remarkable. And frankly, it's the greatest perk of my job. Thank you, Bob and Chris. We are spending an afternoon with living history. And I don't mean that they're old. I mean that they are really people who have created history. These are the people who put into laws that some of us might have thought of as dry, two-dimensional public policy issues, but these are the people who can make them into three-dimensional human stories, and the people who were there when the laws went down. None of the people here need an introduction, especially in this room full of astute political observers, but they do need to be welcomed, acknowledged, and identified by at least a few of the many titles that they carried as members of the Rockefeller administration. We'll start down with John Egan. He is former deputy commissioner of the newly created Office of General Services, so also one of the architects of that agency. Moving to your left, John Hanna Jr. is not only former counsel to the Office of Employee Relations under Governor Rockefeller, he is the former deputy commissioner and general counsel to the Department of Environmental Conservation. We have Michael Whiteman here. He is the former counsel to Governor Rockefeller. Joe Persico is a former speechwriter to Governor and then Vice President Rockefeller. And Alan Miller is the former commissioner of the Department of Mental Hygiene under Rockefeller. One of the recurring themes in Oreos and Dubonnet is Rockefeller's desire to and comfort with surrounding himself with the best and brightest minds that he could, regardless of political party. Joe Persico, was he as self-assured and as that would indicate?
Well, the measure of the self-assurance of a man is that he looks at better people, maybe smarter than he is. And Nelson Rockefeller had no trouble with that. He hired people of giant intellect, very comfortable with them. Dr. Ronan, whom Charlie mentioned, was a brilliant, brilliant man. I remember on one occasion when the ghettos were essentially in flame and Nelson Rockefeller wanted to do something about it. He wanted to create an urban development corporation, and he wanted a leading community developer in the country to take it over. He set his sights on a guy named Ed Logue. Ed Logue had a national reputation. So the governor asked Ed Logue to speak to him. Logue said, "Why would I come, Governor? I have the same position in the state of Massachusetts. I own a wonderful home on Beacon Hill. I'm happy as I can be. My kids are in school." And I thought, you just wait. And within about 2 weeks, Ed Logue had moved to Albany.
This isn't the first time I'm hearing this kind of story. John Hanna, you told me the same story yesterday.
Well, I can get the technology with that, my 13-year-old. I came to Albany because I wanted to go to Washington. And George Taylor of the Taylor Law, I was at the Wharton School, and I talked to him, and I said, "I'd like his assistance, and I won't bother you with those details." And he said, "No." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, because what you should be doing is going to Albany, where they're really doing something very creative in terms of public employee relations law." So I came to Albany to go through the motions and be polite and leave and go back to George Taylor. And then I met Michael Whiteman here, Bobby Douglas, Al Marshall, Harry Albright, and maybe I met Joe the first time, I'm not sure. But anyway, I met the staff, and I was so overwhelmed by the quality of these people that much to my wife Jane's surprise, I said, "Guess what? We're moving to Albany." That was actually a plea rather than an order, but that's what we did.
So, Joe Persico, back to his the governor's absolute confidence in himself and his ability to allow people around him who are smarter than himself. Was it something that he carried because of his patrician background, or was it something else?
Undoubtedly, being a Rockefeller builds your self-confidence.
That helps.
So that was part of it. I think but there's something else. There was just a genetic gift that he had because he had brothers who were successful men. But Nelson, who was not the oldest, became the leader of the family. It was just a manner, an assertiveness, an energy level that led him to be the family leader. He was the kind of man, and I think all of my colleagues will agree with this, when he would come into a room where we were having a meeting, he would suck all the energy out of everybody else who was in charge.
His style of governing is something that Joe Boyd and Charlie Holcomb write a lot about in the book. And John Egan and Alan Miller, you both worked with him in your capacity as heads of agencies. Did he have what kind of style would you say that he had? Was he an authoritarian? Was he an out-of-the-box thinker? John Egan.
Well, it was a wonderful style. And you have to look at most of our backgrounds, like Alan and I wanted to get out of prison. And I was working at a place called Dannemora. And the only way you could get out of there was to escape or take a civil service examination. And I desperately wanted to get out of that place. It was a very negative place, and the only difference between the inmates and the staff was that we went home at night. But I came to Albany for that reason, and I was fortunate to have placed high on a civil service list, and there was a rumor around that this new governor was going to recreate government, and it was going to be done along the lines of very politically professionals. That is, you had to have some political connection if you were ever going to head an agency, but in terms of the staff, it was going to be done on the basis of merit. So I got here and I found out that that was very true, that the state government was run under Rockefeller very professionally. And yes, there was political interest in some things, but nothing that ever bordered on the wrongdoing in any way. He was very conscious of the integrity of state government. So that was my wish when I came here. It's been satisfied many times over, but never in an administration that had so many wonderful ideas and the ability to accomplish those ideas. Under Nelson Rockefeller, nothing was impossible. Everything was possible. Think about the State University, how that was literally quadrupled in size, and wonderful buildings. The new buildings that he established, finished up the Harriman campus, that's where I was initially, and announced the South Mall out of the blue. You know, we had $20 million in the bank when we started that, and had to move 1,300 buildings and 3,700 families out of the plot. Only a person with his imagination could do it, and he did it, and we did it. And we did it literally overnight. Now, we didn't have money, and they came up with a very creative way of issuing debt through municipalities. And it was so good that he said, well, let's build some more facilities in other parts of the state. So we built the Utica State Office Building in Watertown and Buffalo and Binghamton and Suffolk County. And finally, we did something that I thought was of so much imagination and was so good for a community, was the Harlem State Office Building, a 21-story building that sits in the heart of Black America. And that was his. And the exciting part, Joe, I don't know if we ever dare to tell this, but on the day we were going to announce that we were tearing an entire block down on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue in the center of Harlem, he loved to get on a piece of equipment, construction equipment. And he'd love to run the throttle and the levers. And we had a big wrecking ball out on the end of a crane. And he didn't do quite what the operator told him. And he hit the wrong building. I always felt that was by design, because that's what the media covered. That the governor better stay as a governor and stop trying to be a construction worker. But he was always very, very interested in those things, and just such wonderful imagination. And who could ever dream of that South Mall and what that was? And despite what you hear about the cost, it wasn't, in today's world, it wasn't that expensive. We started out with $250 million, then he'd get an idea. Every Thursday, you fellas remember this, there was meetings in New York City with the governor and Wally Harrison and General Schuyler, and then subsequently General O'Hara, and he'd have a new thought. And the new thought was that we had a Freedom Arch designed at one end of the plaza. He decided he wanted to have the State Museum there in the library. And it was, we'll do it for $250 million. So there were all those things that said, boy, we can do anything and we will do it. But most importantly, we'll do it the right way. And that's how I leave that administration.
You must have had some very similar but very different experiences as the head of the Department of Mental Hygiene, which doesn't have sort of the glamour of the building of that OGS has. And this is a tough time in history for mental hygiene.
One among many. Am I on?
No.
Not on. Sorry. Which pocket is that?
Try now.
Hello.
Yay.
I was the commissioner of only one of many departments. And as Susan said, not one which was one of the more glamorous, to say the least. And I was thinking back on what I could tell you, which would give you some insights, very personal insights, as to the way the governor related even to a new commissioner, and one in a relatively, in terms of the constant attention, not central as the building of the South Mall or many of the other major projects. I had been working in New York State in the department for less than a year when my predecessor suddenly died, and after a year of search, to my amazement, I was asked if I would be willing to be Commissioner of Mental Hygiene. I had had brief encounters with the governor before, but clearly he's someone who does his homework and somehow thought that I would be a good commissioner. The only evidence that I ever had negative that he had obviously done what he had done and through it with his staff, which is to find out as much as he could about me, is that after I'd been appointed and members of the press were asking me about my background, and one of them said, oh, I suppose you're a Republican, Dr. Miller. And I said, it's odd that you ask. The governor never asked me. Now, I'm sure he probably knew a lot more about me then, but he loved that answer. I want to tell you about some things that happened within the first 2 weeks of my ultimately 9 years in that department. And they tell you something about Nelson Rockefeller. My first week on the job, I got a call from Ann Whitman. The governor would like to have a conversation with you. That's fine. I don't know how often the governor's had conversations with the Department of Mental Hygiene, but he wanted to talk with me. And he sat me down and he was very serious. He said, I want to apologize because we've lost a whole year now in getting on with our project for building a new 3,000-bed psychiatric hospital in Albany. And he had actually, at the advice of my predecessor, used that in his campaign. It was one of the things he said they were going to do. Now, you have to go back 40 years and know that 3,000 beds seems huge, and it was. But when you compare with other New York State hospitals with 15,000 patients and 10,000 and 12,000, and a move throughout the country to try to change the character of psychiatric hospitals, 3,000 bed looked to some as a serious reduction in size. And I said, but Governor, I'm glad that you've lost a year. And he said, why? I said, because personally, I don't think we need anything like a hospital that size. But more than that, there's been no involvement of the people in this region who are going to be using this, the professionals, the people in the voluntary agencies, the patients themselves. We don't have enough information to have planned this intelligently. And he said, you're right. He said, well, come back and tell me what you think. The point was, he had campaigned on an issue, and he heard me, and he listened, and he said, you may be right. Come back next week and tell me more about it. And ultimately, by the way, as you may know, the result was that people all over this region worked together to plan a very much smaller located hospital on the grounds of the medical college with 300 and some odd patients. The fact that he could make that kind of adjustment, looking at the evidence undefensively, I thought was remarkable. And to have this kind of conversation with a new commissioner. The week later, I'll tell you one more, because it illustrates something else about the range within which he worked. There had been publicity in the newspapers because Senator Kennedy had been talking about the terrible problems at Willowbrook State Hospital, which were indeed true. The governor himself had visited there and had spoken about it, but this was a very earnest, serious criticism of the work within this department. And he said, I don't think it's fair for you to be held responsible for something which began 10 years ago. I think you and I and Senator Kennedy ought to get together, which was, to me, relatively new to working at this level of government. I said, of course, oh, a good idea, but I was quite startled. Next week, I had a call from Ann Whitman, come down to 55th Street and meet with the governor and Senator Kennedy, which I did. And I can only tell you, that first of all, the most amazing thing about the story to me is that party was irrelevant. He wanted to work with the people he thought he needed to work with in order to solve a problem. As a result of that meeting, by the way, Senator Kennedy said he understood and he would back us all the way, which he did. It would not have happened without the governor's intervention. So I think these are small examples of the way he interacted with a relatively minor member of his cabinet.
Michael Whiteman, maybe you can help by setting the stage for us. In this era, the executive had enormous power, much, and the legislative, the legislature had much less power than it does now. In terms of the dynamic between Rockefeller and the legislative leaders, what was he able to do that, say, the current governor or hypothetically a governor couldn't do as easily?
Well, I won't compare him to any specific governor. We've all made the same mistake. Now it's on. I'm not going to compare him to any specific governor. I'm certainly not going to compare him to the incumbent. I think that is not something I want to engage in. But what were his strengths, and why was he able to accomplish? I think what you've been hearing around the table is a description of what I would describe theoretically as a three-legged stool upon which his success was based. The governor always had, first and foremost, he wanted to govern. Politics were interesting. They were a means by which he could govern, but his interest was in governing. It was not in playing the political game. So he always had an arc, a set of objectives that were at the end of an arc, the place that he wanted to get, a problem or a series of problems that he wanted to resolve, a recognition that the quickest way to get to the other end wasn't necessarily a straight line. A step forward and a step back and another step forward would work. Secondly, he was a very strong executive. He would identify a problem. He would define the outcome that he wanted to achieve. He would plan means of getting there, but always consulting with the leaders, consulting with individual members of the legislature, consulting with the staff, consulting with people outside. And then he would designate somebody to decide what the plan was, designate somebody to carry it out, and give that person
his or her head, and then hold them accountable for performance. And being held accountable for performance didn't mean that you got punished if something went wrong, but he wanted to know when something went wrong. I believe there's a story in the book that relates that his answer to a mistake was, well, that's too bad. What are we going to do to fix it? Because we've got to get on with the program. And lastly, he was a very, even though it was second to governing, he was a very effective politician. He understood that in order to govern, he needed to be elected. Equally importantly, he understood that the members of the legislature with whom he was dealing also needed to get elected, and that meant that they had to be able to take something home. And negotiations towards the solution of a governmental problem worked because he would work to find a way that the other fellow could claim some victory too. And I think that those are the three legs of the stool: a desire to govern, a capacity for being to be an executive, and a savviness about politics as an instrument, as a means for achieving the governance goals.
So let me ask you, the shorthand conventional wisdom that we hear in the LCA handed down from generation to generation is that he was really the boss, that the legislative leaders did his bidding. Not that they were followers, but that he really had the power.
Not always without a struggle. Sometimes the members of the legislature thought that they were entitled to some power, and they would assert that. But he seemed to be able to play that. I always thought that he liked best the years when we had a Republican Senate and a Democratic Assembly, and he could play one off against the other, the more conservative Senate and the more liberal Assembly, and that he could sort of navigate between the two and get to the other shore more readily in those days than when he had an all-Republican legislature, or the one year there was an all-Democrat legislature. Of course, that year was such a bizarre year anyway, from beginning to end, with the houses not organizing until John Dunn, when was that, late March? And then it was hard to tell which was the majority party, because the Speaker and the Majority Leader were actually elected by a coalition government.
It looks like Joe Persico wants to say something.
I just want to pick up on something that John Egan said about the governor's pleasure in constructing. One of his favorite sayings was, "I like to see the dirt fly." And on one occasion, I'd gone to his office to clear a speech, and this is at a point when the South Mall, as it was then called, Empire Plaza today, was about half finished, and the Corning Tower was up about 20 stories. And I'd gone in there, and the governor was staring out the window of his office, which overlooked the construction site. And at this 20th floor, there were workmen running around like ants, and some of them had painted in 6-foot-high canary yellow letters, "Rocky's Pyramid." And I looked at the governor, and he looked at me, and he smiled and nodded his head. And that captured the distilled essence of Nelson Rockefeller for me.
As a speechwriter, you have to, speaking of capturing the essence of his, what it is that he wants to impart to people, that was your job. Were you able to talk with him when he sort of did he allow you in? Was the mask of the public mask did it ever drop with you, so you were able to learn or see more of the passion behind the political person?
Well, that leads me to a story, perhaps best left unsaid, but I'll tell it anyway. It was, as a matter of fact, it was on the anniversary of what today is. Today is the event, the Al Smith dinner, which the major candidates are going to be speaking at. And it was an Al Smith dinner many years ago, and I had done a speech for the governor and was waiting to go in and clear it with him. And he was in a meeting with about 20 black community leaders discussing housing. And they were giving him unsure to tell. They were telling him that how can a man like you know what it's like for a black woman with 5 children to live in a slum, in a tenement. You could have no idea what it's like to have one of your children bitten by a rat during the night. And the governor was taking all this and said, no, I have not had personal experience of this, but I have promoted programs of low-income housing in the state to alleviate situations like that. Well, they kept hammering at him. Meantime, I'm looking at my watch because the speech is going to be in a few hours. We haven't cleared it yet. But they kept at him for seemed to me, another couple of hours. Finally, the meeting broke up. And so I followed him up to his office, closed the door. He was ashen. He was haggard. And he slumped back in his chair and he said, those fellas who wrote Amos and Andy sure knew what they were talking about. And I almost fell off my chair. Well, years went by, and I was writing the governor's biography. And I was going through my files, and I found a memo to myself that I'd written because I thought this was such an extraordinary statement. And I thought, well, that would really be a shocker to put in his biography. So at one point I had it in. Then I said, no, I feel uncomfortable with that. So it went in and out, in and out, in and out. Finally, I left it out. My reasoning was this. Here was a man whose record included pioneering legislation, anti-discrimination, housing, education, places of public education, accommodation. He had, along with his family, given something like, I forget, over $100 million to black causes. Clearly a champion of racial justice, had appointed more blacks to offices than any previous governor. And so my final reasoning was, here is a guy who's just been exasperated. He's taken a pounding, trying to do his best to satisfy these people. And very humanly, he lashed out in his exasperation. And I thought, and he's done so before a presumably loyal member of his staff that he can trust. And so I felt very good about never saying anything about that in the book. And it just was such a human moment to see how people could get on his nerves and arouse his passion.
Can I
Yes.
just apropos that theme? You referred to his support in many ways, not only as governor, but as an individual and as a member of that family. And I will never forget having a conversation with Althea Simmons, who at that time headed the NAACP team that eventually led to the passage of the 1952 Act. And people were referring to various important people in their lives. This was a meeting far. Am I on?
I don't think so. We'll try that, okay. Try it.
I was referring to a conversation with Althea Simmons, and in a context in which she was obviously almost felt the need to add something to a conversation that was going on at a meeting of the foundation in Texas, and she said, I would not have been here in my position, in the position to do the work I have done, if it had not been for Nelson Rockefeller, and referred at some length about efforts as an individual and his family for having supported education in communities in some of the southern states in which the education for segregated education is poor. and his personal involvement in rescuing her, and I'm sure there would be many others, had they known it, who could have made the same statement.
A week doesn't go by, John, Hannah, that someone around here says, you know, it's time to repeal or reform the Taylor Law or the Triborough Amendment. Could you share a story with us behind the Taylor Law? And then, John Egan, in part two of this question, would you reflect on the impact that the law is currently having on New York?
The Taylor Law was enacted before I came. Indeed, I was the third employee of the Office of Employee Relations, not including the secretary, who was a very nice lady. So my job was really the implementation of this process, rather than questioning its soundness. I was there anyway before I came, which is the reason I came. I thought this was an important new milestone for labor relations, and I wanted to be part of how you did that. So we were trying to work out how you did it, and it's a subject of another discourse at some length, but at the time I had a big fight about the management rights clause in our contracts, because I've always been a little nervous about a private party having a contract with the government that was perpetual. But that's a different issue.
And this is about striking employees, that they're not allowed to strike the Taylor Law? If you could just remind people what it is.
Well, the Taylor Law says the public employee can't strike. It was substituted with a rather convoluted economic trial in which you tried out your argument for why you should receive more pay or not. I will say that Alan certainly suffered through the strike in whatever it was, 62, which involved primarily mental hygiene. Strike, which was an extraordinarily painful experience. And if I could be lighthearted about something that wasn't very lighthearted, at something like 12 o'clock in the middle of the night or 1 o'clock or something like that, we were trying to work our way through, and we had to go see Al Marshall, we being Alan's employee relations assistant and me, and we went into to Al Marshall, the secretary of the governor, and with a great booming voice, he slammed the desk with a big smile on his face. He looked at Alan's assistant and said, "This is why we pay you $80,000 a year." And of course, his salary in those days was nowhere near $80,000 a year. But it broke the ice, because both of us were, we were getting along well, but I mean, the tension was palpable. How are we going to care for these people during the strike, et cetera? That doesn't really answer your question, but I think your question will require hours of discussion. And I've, of course, been apart from the development of the Taylor Law with respect to the state since 1973 or so. So should we say I'm a little out of date, except for reading the newspaper?
Well, would you like to comment then on how it is impacting government today? I mean, we keep hearing from people who would like to repeal or reform the Taylor Law, and in addition to that, the Triborough Amendment of the Taylor Law, which I think came after the Rockefeller administration.
Well, I still think it's important that there has to be a mechanism for having labor relations discussions, and the Taylor Law, I still think, is a powerful way of doing that. Again, I don't think this is the subject for this event, which is a little different, but I think one place where it's always been rather difficult is, to what extent should the legislature be in the process of giving away the goodies, or should it only be through collective bargaining? And obviously, I'm in favor of doing it through collective bargaining, but people will go to power wherever it is. And
so, John Egan, would you reflect about the impact that law is currently having on New York?
No, I think it was a natural evolution. You know, the private sector was organized, the employees were, and it was natural that in government employees would want some of the same protections. There were managers that didn't like that, but there were managers who were enlightened that said, we'll adjust to it and we'll make it work. And I think it's worked quite well. I think Triborough, probably one could make an argument that would make it a little easier, but overall, it hasn't impeded the progress of the state.
Michael Whiteman, this was an era of tremendous growth, and it incurred some debt. I can't remember which one of you was talking about, I think it was John Egan, talking about borrowing, and it'll cost $250 million there, $250 million here. That sort of growth is, we're having trouble sustaining that tax burden to some degree today, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, you don't make progress if you don't. I told myself I'd remember to turn this on. There it is. Maybe it'll work now. Well, you don't have an omelet without breaking eggs, and if you don't spend some money, you don't make much progress. And if we don't want to spend money, then we don't have to have a state university or a Rockefeller Institute or a whole variety of other things. Money was more readily available 30 years ago. But it seems to me that there have to be a lot of ways of dealing with the fiscal problem, and simply closing down is not going to be the answer. What's going to be the answer is more economic development, so there's a greater tax base. I'm like John. He's going to take me back into Government 101, which was 30 years ago. And that's kind of a big outdoor question.
Yeah, just a reflection on, we talk about it every single day. I'm sure you read about it in the paper every day, that municipalities are having a tough time. Did you want to respond, Joe Persico?
Well, before we get into that, a moment ago we were talking about matters that reveal the human Nelson Rockefeller.
Sure.
I'd like to tell one story in that connection.
I think everyone would be happy about that.
That year, the key of Nelson Rockefeller's legislative program was to promote no-fault insurance. No-fault insurance meant that instead of parties saying it was your fault, no, it was your fault, you remove the fault element and let the insurance companies fight it out. So he wanted to plug this piece of legislation, and I thought that an ideal place would be before the League of Women Voters, who were a very important, vital, active group in the state. So I wrote a speech for him, which promoted the merits of no-fault insurance. And in the speech, I had written something like this. Suppose you were in an accident. Suppose you were injured. Supposing you couldn't pay your bills. And then went on to relate how no-fault insurance would cure these problems. Well, the governor must have read the speech just before he went on, and he must have felt uneasy about inflicting this pain on his audience. So he turned it upside down, and he said, suppose I had an accident. Suppose I was injured. Supposing I couldn't pay my bills. Well, the laughter among the ladies was clocked at full 7 minutes. And afterwards, a delegation of them came to my office and said, did you write that? If you want me, I'll answer the other question, but I can't remember.
No. What was it like when you traveled with him? Yeah.
Okay. We talked a little bit about Nelson Rockefeller as a presidential aspirant. He did not become president, not for lack of trying, He was involved in a number of campaigns, and he was a man of such immense ability and so attractive that it seemed to me an anomaly that he hadn't made it. But one time he was on a mission to Latin America, which he was conducting on behalf of Richard Nixon, then President Nixon, and we were going to all sorts of countries promoting goodwill in Latin America. And we were in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and the governor held a press conference. And among the questions, one of the Argentine reporters raised his hand and he said, "Senor Rockefeller, why is it that you never became president of your country?" And he said, "I was in the wrong party," which absolutely stunned me again. But I thought about it afterwards and I thought, well, Franklin Roosevelt was an attractive anomaly. He was a rich, privileged man who became a champion of the people. A wealthy, privileged man like Nelson Rockefeller remaining as a Republican didn't have quite that much appeal. But I thought it was very revealing that he said this 6,000 miles away from Albany.
Alan Miller?
Just want to add one note, which I'm sure you know very well, that Nelson Rockefeller was in Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet. And the fact that party designation was much less important to him at that time than it ever was, except as its political consequences might have. Yeah.
John Egan, I wonder what he would think of the Republican Party today.
Philosophically, or I really am not in a position to.
On the advice of counsel, you should plead the fifth.
There's a little difference. You know? I mean, in Ohio it's one thing, in Pennsylvania it's another, and in Georgia it's a third thing.
It was then too, wasn't it? Different, different parts of the country, being a Republican or being a Democrat meant different things.
Yeah, but I think that's the beauty of Nelson Rockefeller. You know, I came out of the country as a Democrat. That didn't matter. In the terms of the professional civil service, that didn't enter into it. The commissioners, yes.
Well, even at that level, it didn't matter that much. When I was first hired, like Alan, I was not asked what my party affiliation was. I arrived in Albany and asked my immediate superior what I was supposed to do about party affiliation. And he looked back at me and he said, "Just don't embarrass us." Later, I mentioned to my boss, the then counsel to the governor, Sol Corbin, that the local committee chair for my hometown had puffed himself up and told my father, in essence, that he was responsible for my having a job as a confidential law assistant, which was my first title. And I said, "Is there any truth to that?" To which the answer was, "If there had been any truth to that, you wouldn't have this job."
Can I throw in one more point on this subject of Nelson Rockefeller's total dismissal of politics among the people he recruited? When I was under consideration to be a speechwriter, I started thinking, I don't know how this is going to play. But the last time I was involved in politics as a young man, it was as executive secretary for the state Young Democrats. And it cut no ice.
Did you want to say something, John Hanna?
Well, in my position, I never was asked what my party affiliation was, which happened to be Republican, but I never was asked. But while I was the commissioner, I had occasion to hire people.
You should turn that on. I'm not sure, actually.
Anyway, I was in a position to offer positions to people, and I hired a number of very capable people. And this fellow on my right, I understand, got a lot of static, which I heard hardly anything, if any, from the Republican chairman in that part of the country, demanding first more jobs. But I was never interfered with, and what's the old expression, I guess, we both came to the same conclusion. The chairman, me, I didn't want there people. There were some good ones, but I mean, that was
It says a lot, yeah. The meritocracy was alive and well in the Rockefeller.
Just
Yeah.
to underline that, the Department of Mental Hygiene had 60,000 employees. And there were many, many opportunities for people to promote the people according to their party affiliation, one job or another. And with the governor's knowledge and approval, I spoke to people who were responsible for directing applicants. And it was a clear understanding, which was never abridged, that he would be glad to interview and consider anybody, but that party affiliation had no bearing on our decision, and that was never touched.
We wanted to open up the group for questions from the audience. And we have a microphone, and Michelle will walk around with it. Who has some questions? Someone needs to be able to formulate that key question to get them all to open up, to tell the good stories.
I realize it's a little touchy subject, and it was raised once already about what the governor would think about the Republican Party at the present time. So let's rephrase it a little bit and say, how would he operate if he were faced with some of the situations we've all seen in the last 2 years?
John Egan?
good for you.
You adjust to the situation. Regardless of politics or if it's other philosophies, you adjust to the philosophies. If you're a manager or a leader, if you're in the military, you adjust to what the colonel is going to say or says, or what the tactics are. You adjust to that, and you don't have to break the law doing it or break your own standards.
Joe Persico?
Well, I think that considering the incendiary nature of the abortion issue today, it might be well to look at how Nelson Rockefeller behaved as a Republican in that era. I think one of the most courageous things, if not the most courageous thing he did, was to advance legislation making abortion legal, which didn't mean that we're going to have an explosion of abortions. It meant that abortions were going to be conducted in healthy, sanitary, humane conditions. But he advanced this legislation, and I must give credit to Happy Rockefeller, because my understanding is essentially that she sold Nelson on supporting the issue. And what I thought at the time was, good, we resolved a decade, if not centuries-old issue. Finally, common sense has come to the fore. We've done something humane and sensible. Well, what shocked me was thereafter, every single place I ever accompanied as governor, and as vice president, there they were, the opponents calling out Rockefeller, the baby killer, Rockefeller, the murderer, and holding up their signs reflecting the same sun. So through the years, I've come to think of how even more courageous his move was than I thought at the time.
Who has a question? Oh, yeah.
I was just going to add something. I was just going to add something to that. It was my impression, and I was sort of an observer because I was an aide to an aide as opposed to an aide to the governor. But my impression is, and it came out particularly when the tapes came out from the Nixon administration, how puzzled people like Michael and other people in the administration were at the way they went about the process of deciding. Because their general practice, the Rockefeller administration people, was trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. And then now what's the politics that we've made the decision now that we have the courage to do it, or how are we going to manage it? Whereas what came out in the Nixon tapes was they were trying to, Holcomb in particular, they were trying to decide what the political question answer should be before they've decided what it is the right thing to do. And I think that was the mark of the Rockefeller administration.
What did Rockefeller say about Watergate to you guys?
About what?
Watergate.
Watergate? He never said anything to me, but then on the other hand, he didn't often say things to me. Anyway.
No, but I think it's important, Susan, to remember what he did say about liberalism, what he said about diversity in the workforce, hiring minorities. That building we built in Center Parliament wasn't going to get him any votes from the Republican Party. There weren't any Republicans there. You know, employment opportunities, training. I'd say he was, that was the beauty of him. In so many things, he could switch over from a conservative philosophy to a very liberal philosophy, especially where it concerned human rights.
I wonder where he would fit into the political spectrum today.
He'd be very lonely.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Michael, this is probably a question for you, but I'll open it up to the rest of the panel. And you were talking about negotiating styles, and when a person comes from the great privilege that the governor did, when you go into a confrontation, perhaps with a legislator, the question is, would he feel that he was on an equal footing with that legislator? Or would he come into it with a sense of self-perceived entitlement?
Good. He was remarkably, I won't say open to, I think he genuinely liked to hear what other people had to say. He was remarkably respectful of anybody who had knowledge on a subject and was willing to speak, to use the contemporary expression, to speak truth to power. He respected that. If you came in knowing nothing and talking a lot, or came in hat in hand and afraid to speak to him, he would be polite, but you didn't get much time and you probably never got a second interview. But if you came in with knowledge, especially if you had more knowledge than he had, and were willing to speak out, he valued that. And you were someone who would be invited back the next day.
I can add, as I think anyone in this room could, knowing about the Rockefeller family, that there was a very explicit intent on the part of his father that they not regard themselves as privileged. And they worked at it. It's not easy to work at it when you know you have unlimited resources. But they really did work at it, and its way affected all of them. And I was also privileged on many occasions to be at his home in early morning, and he would sit down every morning with his two sons, then preschoolers or young schoolers, and they would talk about, there was an explicit effort to make them regard themselves as really human beings like all. I mean, there was no sense of privilege. As much as they could minimize that, hard as it would be in a huge house and with unlimited resources, that was part of the ethic of that family.
Over here.
This is incredibly valuable. You know, there are so many stories about the governor and his administrations and to hear some of them validated and some of them debunked is worthwhile. But one of them has to do with American aristocracy. He said that when he arrived in Albany, he had all of these initiatives, these ambitious initiatives, and they required money, and he went out with public referenda, and the majority of the referenda for education and housing and the environment were defeated. A number were passed, but a majority were defeated. And he went to John Mitchell in the city, and John Mitchell came up with a variety of tax financing schemes, tax-exempt bonds and moral obligation bonds. But I'm curious, when someone who has such dreams confronts political reality, rejection of his referenda, what happened? I mean, internally, what happened? Did he give up on these plans? Did he look for creative financing?
May I answer that one? What he did was he would seduce the opposition. He would treat the Democratic leader of the assembly like his best friend. He would court people who were on the other side. I remember vividly, there was a Brooklyn Democratic leader named Meade Esposito who could influence voters in the state legislature. Nelson Rockefeller had Meade Esposito over for dinner, and towards the end of the evening, Mr. Esposito was looking around the art that bedecked this home of Nelson Rockefeller in Manhattan, and he was particularly taken with a Picasso. And the governor said, "Meade, take it." And Meade took it. Of course, it was a copy, but it had the desired effect. He would draw people in, conquer them with his satisfaction with them, his admiration for them, and I think he accomplished just as much. Mike would be better spoken on this than Republicans, Democrats. He managed to woo them all.
Michael?
Well, I think Joe is something about my mic. Joe is quite right. He would have wooed them. He not only gave Meade Esposito a copy of a Picasso, he also went to the gun club in Brooklyn, which was Meade Esposito's hangout, and met all his friends there. But I did want to comment. The bond issues that failed, for the most part, were housing bond issues. Transportation bond issues passed. Environmental bond issues passed. It was really a function of where the public was, I think. There's a little aside on the transportation bond issue of, I think it was 1967, which some of my colleagues up here, and maybe many of you sitting out there will recall, was a $2.5 billion bond issue for all kinds of transportation. And the governor had initially proposed suggested in a staff meeting a much smaller bond issue, and I've forgotten what the figure was, but it seems to me it was about $250 million. And his budget director, T. Norman Hurd, said, well, let me think about that, and went home that night and came back in the next morning and said, oh, we could never do it. We could never do $250 million. And the governor and the others sitting around thought that Norm was going to come back with a very sharp pencil and say the most we should go for is 100 or something like that. And Norm came back with $2.5 billion, and the governor's eyes started to light up because now he could see that here was a project worth doing. But going back to the housing bond issues, what was his reaction? I don't know that you could draw a line from point A to point B and say, here are cause and effect, but we came up with the Urban Development Corporation, which was capable of providing housing, constructing housing, and avoiding the obstacle of having to go to an electorate which simply was not going to support a bond issue for housing.
One more question?
Thank you very much. A national agenda is going to be very different from what a state can do, even a big state. So I was just wondering, what do you think he really wanted to accomplish at the national level as a president? If there are just a couple of things, especially whether it be domestic policy, you think that he really wanted to do?
Joe?
One thing that he would want to do is to remain in the Oval Office. And he would, Nelson Rockefeller was not so much a liberal, and he was not certainly a conservative, but he was an activist. And he would attack problems in a grand way on the national scale, just as he had in the state. Think big. Don't be put off by any obstacles. Woo your opposition. I think he'd have been an extraordinarily successful president domestically.
I think we're out of time, but this has been fascinating, and thank you very much.
10 seconds?
Yes, you can. Alan Miller, 10 seconds.
Because it's important. We've been talking about Nelson Rockefeller as a national figure, as a policy-making figure, as someone who knew how to get things done. We haven't talked about Nelson Rockefeller as the administrator of the state's governments and his concern for and his relationship to every department, which was conveyed not only an intent and an interest, but a knowledge of direction. So that it may seem like, looking at it from a world's perspective, that that's less important. I can tell you, he took his job as the administrator of the state's government very seriously, and included a clarity of purpose and direction, which I think is not unconnected with the fact that if you talk with anybody who was working at any level in any of the departments during that period, they would say that they had never felt more part of a combined effort in their lives, before or since. A remarkable accomplishment.
They felt they worked for him.
They worked for the state.
Thank you very much for joining us.